Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new edition of Vistila de Medidas Cautelares. And today we have a guest. Very, very interesting, considering all the current judicial news we have in Spain and above all the corruption cases, and not to forget technology. How important it is to use technology to secure the evidence that later has to be presented before a court of law. And now I'm going to introduce you to this new guest who wanted to join us in this preliminary hearing on precautionary measures. His name is Unai Tapia, CEO of Probatia. How are you, Unai? It's a pleasure to greet you.
Hello, I'm good, Miguel Angel Perez. Likewise, thank you very much.
Well, I have to say that Unai has a Spanish platform called Probatia. And first of all, Unai, later I will ask you how we can apply these uses of this platform you have created, Probatia, which is extremely important for all legal cases to secure evidence. First of all, Unai, I would like you to explain to me exactly what this platform, this tool that you have designed to secure evidence for a legal process consists of, Unai.
Yes, well, to sum up, what Probatia really designed and created was a system, right? And this system was created because there are already regulations that allow us to manage evidence. The problem is that there is a lot of lack of knowledge in the world of justice among law enforcement and security forces, and this sometimes causes problems, right? So, well, what we did was develop a framework. What happens is that, of course, explaining the theory to lawyers is all well and good, but then they have to start working with it and they don't know what to do. So what we did was develop the tool that allows you to do all that work in a more or less standardized way, right? So that any lawyer, any police officer, or any investigator can do it, can carry out that work with full legal safeguards, right? In the end, we're talking about evidence, and when we talk about evidence, evidence is evidence for a reason, right? And that's because it has to reflect the fact that has occurred, right? It's a witness, let's say, right, of a fact, right? And we have to be able to question that witness, as you said, and be able to get information about the fact, right? So, well, we need to be able to apply all the techniques to be able to obtain the information that the evidence gives us. So, well, what did we do? We developed a platform, a technology that makes this task easier, let's say. Lawyers, investigators, law enforcement, state security.
And it's very important tonight to highlight how all that evidence is certified by Probatia for trial purposes and what types of evidence can be presented as certified through your platform.
For example, when a case is started, certain elements have to be added to the case, such as the action that was carried out, an intervention. Let's imagine, for example, that it's a search of a home. The seized items could be, for example, a laptop, mobile phones, memory cards, and so on. And then the evidence contained in each of them, right? So, well, all of this gives context to the evidence, right? What we do is allow the user to add the evidence to that, so the evidence has a record attached to it. From there, how the evidence is certified, what we do is create a traceability system. So we control who accesses the evidence, what is done with it. The evidence is analyzed in a way that gives us its probative value. Because here, in addition, we are at a time when it's very easy to create WhatsApp conversations, images, videos, audio files, anything out of nothing. And moreover, it's getting harder and harder to tell what's artificial from what isn't. So, well, what we do is we analyze all of that in order to give the user an assessment of the evidence's probative value and decide whether it is fit to be presented in court. We use very common, very standardized technologies because it's true that before we wanted to be very disruptive and very innovative, but we realized that in the end, what we need is for anyone to be able to reproduce the same work we've done, right? So, well, we've used technologies that are easily reproducible and moreover come from authorities. For example, timestamping authorities, where any activity that is done on a piece of evidence could be a phone conversation, for instance. Well, every activity that is done on that phone conversation, all of it, every activity, let's say, we record it and create an audit trail for that piece of evidence, right? So that we know what has happened at all times, who has intervened, where it was handled, and what has happened in general throughout the entire life cycle of the evidence. Because you have to keep in mind that the evidence that is seized and then presented in court can be kept in custody for a year, 2 years, 5 years, you never know, right? So, well, it's important that access control is scrupulous because that evidence can lead a person to loss of e-certificate. So, well, we have to be very cautious. That scrupulous access, scrupulous.
And Unai, you mentioned that an example of evidence would be, for example, a phone call. What other examples are there? WhatsApp messages, of course, which are so popular nowadays. In all the legal cases closing in on the government of Pedro Sanchez, where the UCO is involved, even the UDF, besides WhatsApp messages and phone calls, is there any other kind of evidence like that? Any other example of important evidence for the trials?
Well, we're talking about communications. So in communications, there would be emails, WhatsApp conversations, Telegram, any communication that happens between several parties, right? Documentation, right? So there we have PDF files, Word documents, that kind of thing. Images, right? Also, Probatia comes from an association of scientific and forensic imaging. So image processing is very important, right? So we work with telemetry images. We also detect whether the image has been manipulated or not, if it has been edited, if it has been processed, for example, if it comes from a social network, that kind of thing. So we analyze the images. Sometimes you can crop an image, for example, and you can't tell, right? So, well, we detect all those changes, right? Video as well. So, well, in a video, for example, there can be some keyframes. So what the platform wants to do is work on those keyframes, right? Without ever losing traceability, right? Because here we have another problem. And the thing is, if I have a video and from that video I get keyframes, which are the ones I need to present in court, and there is no relationship or link between what I present and the video that was seized. For example, in a closed circuit recording system, what can happen is that at the source and at the destination, you have different pieces of evidence and they can be ruled inadmissible, right? Because they're actually different, right? They're different pieces of evidence. So what we do is establish those links with the original, which is what the police, for example, sees, and the derived material, which is what has been analyzed and presented in court. So, well, we actually work with any type of evidence that can be analyzed digitally.
You mentioned AI, artificial intelligence, which for everyone is, of course, a major breakthrough. But when it comes to your work, it can also be a big obstacle because all kinds of evidence can be manipulated. These are messages, audios, emails, photos, videos. AI can manipulate everything. That's actually one of Probatia's strengths, being able to verify evidence and distinguish which ones are real and which ones have been altered with AI.
Yes, look, at first, what we did was assume that any evidence that couldn't be original because we couldn't establish its originality was going to be artificially generated, right? Nowadays, it's true that we've added some elements that allow us to detect the use of artificial intelligence because sometimes the human eye can't fully identify what we're seeing. We can't tell if that's AI or not, especially now with more sophisticated technology, right? But it's true that there are standards and techniques to detect if artificial intelligence has been used. There is a standard called C2PA that is being used, for example, to label content that has been generated with artificial intelligence. And if not, we also detect anything that may have been generated with AI, right? And this is also important for the same reason, because we don't want evidence generated with AI to send someone to jail, right? So, well, it's important that there are guarantees both from a technological point of view for us and from a human point of view, right? For those people who are involved in any case.
Unai, the use of evidence regarding, for example, social networks, right? For example, in recent days, we've seen people insulting others. Well, in recent days, since social networks have been around, it's a daily thing, right? But for example, the other day, I remembered the case of Ines Sainz, who was being insulted on social networks on Twitter. Just imagine that suddenly Ines Sainz wants to file a complaint against a Twitter user. The identity behind that Twitter user is unknown. How can Probatia help Ines Sainz or any user who wants to, for example, report defamation, insult, or slander they are being subjected to on social media in that legal process? Yes, in this case, for example, what we have is a situation where posts are being made.
Defamation or some type of content that could be illegal. How does that process work for Sainz in this case? to report it because, well, very serious accusations are being made on social media. We perform forensic analysis on all content, certifying, sealing, and examining it. It may be illegal, and in this case, it likely is, since serious accusations are being made on social media. So what we do is a forensic extraction of all that content to prove that it is original and that it exists. And we do this because sometimes it can happen that the user themselves says, I delete the message, I cause the harm, I delete the content, the harm remains, my content disappears, and nothing can happen to me, right? So, well, what we do is we always act quickly and prove the existence of that message at that moment in time. From that point on, if the suspect wants to delete the information, they can do it, but the evidence is there, the content is there, and what we do is make that process easier. And that evidence can be used in this case for the prosecution or whatever claim applies, right? In the case of Ines, for example, well, she wasn't threatened, but they did publish content that could damage her reputation, and in fact, we believe it does. So, well, what we understand is that it's evidence that can be, and surely will be used in this case against the perpetrator, right? So, well, in this case, as we said before, lie in the extraction we've done is a witness to that event, right? So, well, that witness is what will accompany the lawsuit that will be filed against him.
I think that this, correct me if I'm wrong, Unai, but I believe that Probatia is a cross-cutting platform, meaning you can be hired by a user, by a regular individual, let's say a user, right? Who is suffering some kind of, well, harassment on social media. And you can also be hired by lawyers. I don't know if you can also be hired by, say, government agencies, law enforcement, or state security forces that might need to certify evidence. Who can hire you?
Yes, well, look, depending on the profile, let's say there are different uses, right? For example, in the case of law, usually what is most important is the preservation of evidence, right? Besides, the lawyer usually isn't very clear about what to do with that evidence, right? Well, as a victim, for example, I provide a series of pieces of evidence that I have, and the lawyer says, well, what do I do with this, with this? Well, now that you have the tool, you can use it. Uh-huh. Law enforcement and security forces can also use it to record the operations they carry out, right? Because the system allows you to validate, for example, an operation like a home search, where they give you a series of checks to say, well, any evidence that comes from this action may or may not be valid in court, right? Because sometimes there isn't judicial authorization, right? The system guides you so you can proceed, especially for law enforcement and security forces. But for example, it could also be useful for a journalist, right? Probatia is going to incorporate soon, we're already testing it, a deep cross-sectional investigation system, right? That allows you to cross-reference communications, documentation, any content, right? And it allows you to extract findings, patterns, it allows you to extract, for example, facts, timelines, and so on, right? And it's also interesting because we've done a research exercise to run these tests specifically with the cases that are currently in the news, right? For example, the Plus Ultra case and others, well, where we've been contributing, we've been uploading public documents that we've found to see if by cross-referencing all that information, we could detect any new findings, right? And well, yes, we have detected some interesting things. And what we've done is say, okay, let's analyze this calmly, because one of the problems we usually encounter is that what the system gives me sometimes is a bit out of my control, right? Well, because I'm feeding it large amounts of information and who knows what it might find in there, right? We're also a bit cautious when it comes to this. That's why this new feature will still take a few days to appear. And it's precisely because of the fear of what might happen if I feed it certain information and suddenly it detects certain things, right? So, well, we're being a bit cautious, you know? But it's an exercise that we think is interesting, especially for journalism, right? To be able to investigate large amounts of information.
In recent years, we've seen, Unai, many cases in the media of victims of all kinds of crimes, right? They had as evidence a screenshot of a WhatsApp message, an email, but they didn't know how to certify it or couldn't certify it. And when it got to court, that evidence was dismissed. Probatia would be key for these cases.
Yes, for example, I'm thinking of a well-known case, Lobatos, when he went to certify some WhatsApp messages to ensure the integrity of those messages he had notarized, right? So that's fine. The problem is with the notary, for example, because he can't know. He can't be sure that those messages are artificial, because nowadays there are even apps that generate artificial conversations, right? They have no way of knowing if that information is artificial or original, right? So, well, the notary does what he has to do. He does his part of the job, which is very well done, which is to certify what is being given to him, right? So, what Probatia does, what it does, is analyze the evidentiary value of what has been used in this case as evidence, which could be a WhatsApp conversation, right? So we said, look, if this message, if these people had had, for example, this tool at their disposal, they would have been able to certify it and also say, okay, now we can prove that this is completely original, right? That it is found within this device and that these conversations and these phrases or these elements actually took place, right? I mean, clear evidence that it actually happened, right? And that's what interests us, right?
We have to remember that Lobato was Juan Lobato, the leader of the PSOE in Madrid, who was there and testified as a witness in the case of the Attorney General Alvaro Garcia Ortiz. And as Unai explained well, he received a series of messages from a leader of the Socialist Party, right? Who was urging him to make the famous emails against Ayuso's boyfriend public. And he tried to certify these messages from that socialist leader. But the issue was that he was trying to do it with a notary, right? Also, Unai, in recent days, there has been a lot of controversy with the Zapatero case because the famous WhatsApp messages from his secretary, now known to everyone as Gertrudis, have been leaked. I don't know, from your point of view as a digital forensics expert, well, in all this certification of documentary evidence and communication evidence, what do you make of these WhatsApp messages being leaked? Do they lose any kind of validity in court? Does it make any difference? Is it simply a matter that goes along with political controversy, public opinion, and the media? Does the fact that the raw content of those WhatsApp messages became known have any kind of impact? Because, for example, people close to Zapatero complained that the so-called expurgation hasn't been done, which means removing those messages that concern private matters and have nothing to do with the investigation, and that all of this has been made public in the media.
Well, legally, I don't know, because that's also something they themselves will have to analyze, right? On a technical level, if those conversations took place, that's one thing. Ideally, first of all, it wouldn't have been leaked, obviously, so that the police or the security forces, even the analysts, could have continued with their work, right? On the other hand, if, for example, that phone, in this case, I think it was Gertrudis's phone, which was the one that was analyzed, the one that was tapped and analyzed. There was an extraction of the conversations from that phone. There's a whole procedure, right? And there's traceability, right? So, well, here we believe that it is possible to know who accessed it with full names and when it was accessed at that time. Well, it can be done. There would be a second investigation to know exactly what the traceability is, right? Not of the messages themselves, but of the access to all that, to that conversation, because I also think it was a lot of information. I think it was about 2,000 files or 2,000 pages of conversations, right? So, well, we would have to see exactly who accessed it, because really, even if someone, for example, thinks, I'm going to take this, I'm going to download it, I'm going to send it, and nothing happened here, right? But behind the scenes, there are traces. I mean, there are almost always traces of everything we do with a computer or a mobile phone, right? So, well, what should be done here is to analyze and investigate exactly what traces there are, where they are, and who could have done it, right? Technically, it is possible to know who leaked it, right? Because there are traces, right? All servers, even devices, generate those traces, right? The traces, when we talk about traces, we're talking about a log. We're talking about a series of files that record exactly the date and time of what was done and who did it, right? So, well, it would be a matter of looking into it.
And Unai, your work doesn't conflict with that of the court experts. I mean, actually, you really just provide a tool that court experts can use.
Yes, it's a tool that we provide to experts, for example, who normally use it for their analyses. For example, we have some who find it quite difficult to analyze emails, right? And Well, in this case, you can analyze 1,000 emails in 5 minutes, right? So, well, that really is an advantage we give them, right? It's really a tool for all these people, isn't it? It even lets them collaborate within the same environment so that traceability isn't lost because you're already operating within that environment, right? So, well, the fact of not losing the traceability of the evidence is super important, especially when 2 or 3 years go by and what you don't want is to lose track, right? Because digital evidence is very volatile. It's very easy to manipulate, to change a date, a comma, etc., right? So it's important that it's preserved and that it's known who has worked with it, right? So, well, in these cases, for example, when leaks and so on happen, one of the problems is that you can't tell who was there, right? Because there are many computers, people coming and going, agents and so on, right? So the platform, what it allows both for judicial experts, IT experts, judges to access the evidence, law enforcement, private investigators, and so on, it allows them to cooperate in a protected and secure environment so that all the traceability is there, right? So, well, it's as easy as going to see what happened. We have the history of what happened with that evidence, whether it's been a week or 10 years. That's what we believe is most valuable. Then there's the other part. The other party has to be able to access that because, in this case, for example, we're also seeing how some evidence is being challenged due to the way it was obtained, right? So, well, we also have to be able to show the other party what we've done to preserve all those guarantees around the evidence, right?
Yes, in fact, Zapatero's defense is actually trying to invalidate, for example, all the content from Rodolfo Reyes's mobile phone, who is an executive at Plus Ultra, right? Who handed over that device to the United States, and Zapatero's defense is indeed trying to find a way to nullify that evidence by saying that it hasn't been possible to certify how the data was extracted, how the information was cloned, and so on. That also reminds me, Unai, that in many cases, almost all of them by now, it's become a classic to wipe the phone. Everyone who gets caught coincidentally has wiped their phone, leaving it almost back to factory settings. And of course, the UCO and the UDEF say no, if they've already wiped the phone, it's practically impossible to recover the messages. In fact, I remember the case of the Attorney General Alvaro Garcia Ortiz, where they even sent out letters rogatory to the United States, to Ireland, to WhatsApp, to everyone. And in the end, they managed to get a couple of messages that weren't very valuable. It's impossible. I mean, if you wipe your phone, it's already impossible to recover that information, Unai.
Well, you have to keep in mind here, you have to consider several things. There are several layers. For example, the information that's inside the device itself, right? All devices have a storage system. So when we write something in that storage system, like a document, a message, whatever it is, it stays there, right? When we write new messages or new content, they are written in the available space. But what happens when I delete a file, for example? No, what's happening now is that space is not being deleted. What happens is a small tag is placed on it that says the space this file occupies is now available for when new files arrive, right? In other words, it's not empty, it's still there. So, from a forensic standpoint, the phone is usually taken into custody. Also, it's a delicate procedure, right? Because you have to check if it's turned on. If it's turned off, if it has a connection, if the suspect can or cannot access it, etc., right, etc. And what is done is, well, we extract everything that's there, including what's marked to be deleted but hasn't been overwritten yet, right? So, well, at a forensic level, it's possible to obtain information that the user thinks they've deleted, but in reality, it's not deleted. On the other hand, we have the communications you mentioned. So, in this case, what happens? There is something called encryption or encryption, right? That means what we do is on my phone, I see the message, I understand it, but I send it to you. So when I send it to you, what I do is I break it up, I turn it into something that can't be understood, and I leave it with the service I want to use. WhatsApp, for example. WhatsApp takes that element that's completely broken up and gives it to you. And you, on your device, what you do is you put it back together so you can read it, right? So, well, there's that process, right, of sending, copying, and so on, right? That encryption basically is turning something I understand into something that can't be understood, right? And once it's decrypted, it can be understood again at the destination, right? So, well, there's that security between you and me. What happens? that when it's on WhatsApp or when it's on Google or wherever, it's broken up. So it's very difficult to access that information, which is what happened, for example, with the case of the Attorney General. What happened is that those messages, if they're not on the phone because they've been deleted and they're not at the destination either, the only thing we have is a completely broken message on a server. So what we don't know is if the company has the ability to reconstruct those messages, right? So if they can't do it, they would be inaccessible, right? So, well, we usually have those problems here. That's why, not only in this case, but also in others where there are communications, what has been happening is that they've been trying to go directly after the services they were using, like Google or Apple, for example, right? Which are also very closed services, right? I mean, to protect privacy, we have to protect all this content.
I also wanted to ask you, Unai, on a lighter note, so you can explain to the viewers of Medidas Cautelares, are you designing a video game? Explain this using the information from a case file, from a legal case. Explain it to us, Unai.
Yes, the video game. Well, this comes from the feature we were talking about, being able to conduct an in-depth investigation, right? So we cross-referenced a lot of documents and managed to create a matrix of related facts, people, and so on. So, well, what we wanted was to make a small file about this information. What happened is that we said we'd like to do something a bit more interactive. So what we did was develop a small video game where you could see all the actors, all the characters. So, well, we basically turned the case, in this case, the Plus Ultra case, into a video game where the people involved are in a bar, right? And basically they talk to each other, right? So, well, it was a small, little exercise we did to be able to represent in a more comfortable and interactive way, in this case, the Plus Ultra case that we were working on.
Right? And how can you access that video game, Unai?
Well, we haven't published it yet because we want to test it a bit more, but well, it has a very retro look, right? Very much from the 80s. And what we're going to do is, once we have all the elements fitting together, we'll publish it so people can see it, right? Then we'll inform the public so they can access it, right?
I suppose Zapatero will be the main character.
Yes, he's the main character, especially because there's a part with the interrogations where he's there, of course, present, right? Both he and the judge.
Well, that's it, Unai. Honestly, it's been a pleasure, and I'd like you to give us some information just for all our viewers, as you know, who follow us. Well, judges, prosecutors, lawyers, private individuals, law enforcement, and state security forces. Give us some information for all those who are interested. Of course, I'll leave all the information in the video description, but tell us if you have a website or a phone number where people can hire the services of Probatia in order to secure and certify all that communication evidence, that technological evidence for judicial proceedings. UNAI.
Yes, well, Probatia is already available. It can be used. You can find it at www.probatia.com. And well, the message I want to give is that in the face of uncertainty and the problems we may encounter, both present and future, well, Probatia is here to help and make things easier, not only so they can be managed, but also to make things easier, so that justice reaches the victims and their families, especially because Probatia was created for that, right? To be able to help the people who need it and to be able to help the people who help those in need, right? Like law enforcement, lawyers, and so on. It's a tool to make justice more accessible.
Right?
Do you have a phone number, Unai, or is everything done through probatia.com? Yes, everything, including registering and trying it out, can be done on the website. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, that's everything, Unai, and thank you for being here for this little interview. You are released without precautionary measures, Unai. And well, we'll keep your contact information because I'm sure it will be very useful for us to explain many corruption cases, to secure and certify the evidence found in those proceedings, and to be able to explain things as clearly as you have done. So thank you very much, Unai. Thank you for Probatia, for that Spanish platform that will surely help a lot of people, and we'll see you soon, Unai. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Miguel Angel. See you soon.